The notification chime echoed through the corridors of Station Nexus 7 with all the enthusiasm of a funeral bell. Commander Zeltron, a purple-scaled veteran with more battle scars than patience, drummed his claws against the conference table as his intelligence staff shuffled into the briefing chamber like students heading to detention. "All right, settle down, you overpaid desk jockeys," Zeltron growled, his three eyes scanning the room with practiced irritation. "We've got a new species to evaluate, and Command wants a full threat assessment by tomorrow." "Lucky us." Senior Analyst Vorgak, whose blue tentacles were already reaching for his datapad before his chair stopped spinning, cleared his throat with a sound like gargling gravel. "Sir, if I may, this assignment seems rather beneath our usual standards. The species in question barely qualifies as spacefaring." "Oh, really?" Zeltron leaned back in his chair, which creaked ominously under his bulk. "Enlighten us, Vorgak. What exactly are we dealing with here?" Vorgak's tentacles danced across his tablet with practiced efficiency. "The species calls themselves humans, sir. Third planet from a yellow dwarf star in what they call the Milky Way. Frankly, sir, I'm not sure why Command bothered to flag them for our attention." A collective groan rippled through the room. Junior Analyst Kelmax, whose orange fur was already standing on end from static, raised a webbed hand. "Please tell me we're not spending another week analyzing primitive tool usage again. The last species took 3 days to figure out fire." "Worse," Vorgak replied with the tone of someone announcing a root canal. "These humans have barely managed to leave their home planet. They've got some crude metalworking skills, basic projectile weapons, and what appears to be an unhealthy obsession with hitting each other with sticks." Technician Blixara, whose crystalline body segments clinked softly as she shifted in her seat, tilted her head curiously. "Any interesting technological developments? Unique energy sources? Advanced mathematics?" "Well," Vorgak paused, scrolling through his notes. "They have discovered nuclear fission, which is impressive for a species that still fights wars with chemical explosives. Though honestly, their application of it seems rather limited." Commander Zeltron rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar headache building behind his primary eye. "So we're looking at another primitive civilization that discovered boom boom before they figured out basic space travel. Fantastic. What's Command's interest level?" "Minimal, sir. Standard observation protocols. They want us to review their conflict history for baseline aggression metrics, then file the usual no immediate threat report." The room fell silent except for the hum of the environmental systems and the occasional click of claws on datapads. Finally, Kelmax spoke up with the kind of grin that meant trouble. "You know what, Commander? Since this is obviously going to be another boring assignment, why don't we make it interesting? Turn it into a training exercise." Zeltron's middle eye focused on the junior analyst with laser precision. "Explain." "Well, sir, we've got all this human conflict footage to review anyway. Why not set up the main holographic display and watch it together? Make it educational, maybe even entertaining?" Kelmax's grin widened, showing far too many teeth. "I mean, how dangerous could a species be that still hits each other with pointy sticks?" The suggestion hung in the air like a bad smell. Several staff members began nodding, the prospect of breaking up the monotony clearly appealing. Even Vorgak's tentacles perked up slightly. "You know what?" Zeltron stood up, his decision made with the kind of confidence that usually preceded disasters. "Why not? Set up the main display system, Blixara. Let's see what these humans consider warfare. At worst, we'll get a good laugh out of it." Blixara's segments chimed melodically as she activated the chamber's holographic projectors. "Initializing display matrix, Commander." "Oh, yeah. Shall I start with their earliest recorded conflicts?" "Might as well start from the beginning." Zeltron settled back into his chair with the satisfaction of someone who thought he was about to watch a comedy. "Let's see how these primitive humans wage war." The lights dimmed, and the holographic display flickered to life in the center of the chamber. None of them realized they were about to witness something that would fundamentally change their understanding of what it meant to be dangerous in the galaxy. "This should be good," Kelmax muttered, reaching for his snack dispenser. He had no idea how wrong he was about to be. The first holographic images materialized in the center of the briefing chamber, showing what appeared to be organized formations of humans in primitive armor, carrying rectangular shields and short stabbing weapons. The scene depicted a Roman legion advancing across an open field toward another group of humans wielding longer swords and painted shields. "Oh, this is precious," Kelmax immediately burst out laughing, his orange fur rippling with amusement. "Look at them. They're literally just running at each other with pointy metal sticks." Vorgak's tentacles swayed with what passed for chuckling among his species. Notice the complete lack of energy weapons, kinetic barriers, or even basic tactical shields. They're relying entirely on primitive metallurgy and what appears to be shouting. The footage showed the two human armies colliding with a crash of metal on metal, shields splintering, and warriors falling. The aliens watched with the kind of detached amusement typically reserved for watching children play with toys. "Pause it there, Blixara." Commander Zeltron pointed at the frozen image of a Roman legionnaire driving his gladius into an enemy warrior. "Vorgak, what's your analysis of their combat effectiveness?" "Utterly barbaric, sir. They're using crude iron implements to puncture each other's organs. No finesse, no technology, just brute force and sharp edges. It's like watching animals fight over territory." Technician Blixara's crystal segments chimed with what sounded suspiciously like laughter. "The casualty rates must be astronomical. How does a species survive with such inefficient combat methods?" "Apparently by breeding faster than they can kill each other," Kelmax snorted, reaching for another handful of nutritional pellets. "Resume playback, Blixara. Let's see more of this comedy show." The display shifted to show Viking longships beaching on a foreign shore, warriors in horned helmets charging into villages with axes and swords raised high. The aliens' amusement reached new heights as they watched humans wielding double-headed axes, howling battle cries while setting buildings ablaze. Now this is entertainment. Kelmax was practically bouncing in his seat. They're not even trying to be strategic. It's just pure aggression and property destruction. "The tactical sophistication of a meteor impact," Vorgak agreed, his tentacles writhing with mirth. "Notice how they prioritize intimidation over efficiency. Those horned helmets serve no protective purpose whatsoever." The footage continued, showing various ancient battles, gladiatorial combats, and tribal warfare. Each scene brought fresh waves of laughter and commentary from the intelligence staff. Humans seemed to excel at finding new and creative ways to harm each other with increasingly elaborate weapons, but always maintaining the same fundamental approach of direct physical confrontation. "Fast forward to something more recent," Zeltron suggested, wiping moisture from his eyes. "Let's see if they've evolved any actual tactics." The display jumped ahead several centuries, showing medieval siege warfare. Massive stone castles dominated the landscape while armies surrounded them with crude catapults and siege towers. The laughter in the room began to quiet as the aliens watched humans constructing elaborate wooden machines designed to breach fortified walls. "Well, that's slightly more sophisticated," Vorgak admitted, though his tone still carried amusement. "They've at least figured out basic engineering principles." The siege footage showed months of warfare, with attacking armies maintaining their positions despite constant harassment from defenders. Humans died by the thousands, yet the attacks continued relentlessly, day after day, season after season. "Wait," Blixara's chiming became more subdued. "How long has this particular siege been ongoing?" Vorgak checked his data. "According to the historical records, approximately 14 months. 14 months? Kelmax's laughter faltered slightly. "They've been sitting outside those walls for over a year. Why haven't they just given up and moved on to easier targets?" The footage showed human attackers constructing increasingly elaborate siege engines, digging tunnels under walls, and launching everything from stones to diseased animal carcasses over the battlements. The defenders responded with boiling oil, flaming arrows, and their own creative methods of destruction. This is unusually persistent behavior. Vorgak's tentacles had stopped their amused swaying. Most species would have calculated the resource expenditure, and moved on to more profitable ventures. Maybe they're just too stupid to quit, Kelmax suggested, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. The siege footage continued, showing the eventual breach of the walls and the brutal sack of the city that followed. The aliens watched in growing silence as humans poured through the gaps, fighting room by room, building by building, with the same relentless determination they had shown during the siege itself. Commander Zeltron leaned forward in his chair, his casual amusement beginning to transform into something approaching concern. Blixara, how many casualties did both sides sustain in this engagement? Calculating now, sir. Initial estimates suggest approximately 47,000 total deaths. 47,000. Zeltron repeated the number slowly. Over a single city. And the mood in the chamber had shifted noticeably. What had started as entertainment was beginning to feel less amusing and more disturbing. The humans' persistence was starting to look less like stupidity and more like something else entirely. Something the aliens weren't quite ready to name yet. Continue the footage, Zeltron ordered, his voice notably more serious than before. None of them were laughing anymore. The holographic display flickered and shifted to show a landscape that looked like the surface of a dead planet. Mud, barbed wire, and wooden posts stretched endlessly across cratered terrain under gray skies. Then the camera panned down into the trenches, revealing thousands of humans huddled in waterlogged ditches, clutching weapons that had evolved far beyond simple swords and axes. What are we looking at here? Blixara's crystalline segments had stopped their melodic chiming entirely. Vorgak consulted his datapad with tentacles that moved far less confidently than before. This appears to be what humans call their First World War, approximately 100 years ago in their timeline. The tactical evolution is significant. The footage showed human soldiers going over the top of their trenches, charging across open ground toward enemy positions while explosions erupted around them. Machine gun fire cut them down in waves, yet more humans kept coming, stepping over the bodies of their fallen comrades without hesitation. Kelmax had completely stopped eating his nutritional pellets. His orange fur lay flat against his skin as he stared at the display in growing horror. They're running directly into automatic weapon fire. That's suicide. Resume playback, Commander Zeltron ordered, though his voice had lost all traces of its earlier casual authority. The display showed artillery bombardments that turned entire landscapes into moonscapes. Shells the size of small vehicles exploded with devastating force, throwing dirt, debris, and human body parts hundreds of meters into the air. Yet somehow, humans continued to occupy these hellish battlefields for months, even years at a time. Blixara's request came out as a sharp crystalline chime. Commander, I need clarification on these casualty figures. The data can't be correct. What's the problem? Zeltron asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. According to the historical records, this single conflict lasted 4 years and resulted in approximately 16 million human deaths. That's more than the total population of most civilized worlds. The briefing chamber fell completely silent except for the hum of the environmental systems. Even that seemed louder now, like the universe itself was holding its breath. 16 million, Vorgak repeated slowly, his tentacles hanging limp at his sides. In 4 years. Over territorial disputes that could have been resolved through standard diplomatic channels. The footage continued, showing gas attacks that turned the air itself into a weapon. Humans stumbled through yellow clouds that burned their lungs and skin, many collapsing where they stood, while others pressed forward wearing primitive masks that barely qualified as protection. They're poisoning the atmosphere, Kelmax whispered, his voice barely audible. They've made the air itself deadly, and they're still fighting in it. Continue, Zeltron commanded, though his hands were gripping the arms of his chair hard enough to leave claw marks. The display jumped forward in time, showing an even more devastating conflict. Tanks rolled across battlefields while aircraft engaged in aerial combat overhead. Cities burned as bombers dropped payloads that could level entire districts. But it was the footage from the Pacific Theater that truly broke the aliens' composure. Human soldiers fought through tropical jungles, volcanic islands, and coral atolls with a ferocity that made their earlier conflicts look restrained. They threw themselves at fortified positions defended by other humans who fought with equal determination, neither side giving quarter. "Pause the footage," Blixara requested again, her segments now emitting a high-pitched whine of distress. "I need to verify these atmospheric readings. Are those nuclear detonations?" The display showed the mushroom clouds rising over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the devastating power of atomic weapons unleashed for the first time in warfare. The aliens watched in stunned silence as entire cities vanished in balls of nuclear fire. "They've weaponized stellar fusion," Vorgak stated with the tone of someone announcing the end of the world. "A species that was using chemical explosives 50 years earlier has figured out how to harness the power of stars." Junior analyst Threx, a quiet amphibian who hadn't spoken since the briefing began, suddenly stood up from his chair. His green skin had turned a sickly yellow color. "Commander, I need to submit a transfer request." "Immediately?" "Sit down, Threx," Zeltron snapped, but there was no real authority in his voice anymore. "Sir, with all due respect, I signed up to analyze civilizations, not whatever this is." Threx's voice shook as he gestured at the display showing the nuclear aftermath. These humans dropped artificial suns on their own planet, on cities full of their own species. "The casualty estimates for this second global conflict," Blixara announced in a voice like breaking glass, "are approximately 70 million deaths." 70 million. The number hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Kelmac slowly pushed his snack dispenser away from himself, his appetite apparently gone forever. "They went from 16 million deaths to 70 million deaths in the span of 25 years. That's not evolution, that's escalation. And they survived it," Vorgak added quietly. "Not only survived, but continued to advance technologically. The nuclear weapons that ended this conflict became the foundation for even more powerful weapons." Commander Zeltron was gripping his chair so hard that the metal was beginning to bend under his claws. His three eyes were fixed on the display showing the mushroom clouds, his expression a mixture of fascination and growing dread. "Show me their current military capabilities," he ordered. "Sir, are you sure that's advisable?" Blixara asked. "Show me." The display shifted to modern human warfare, and that's when the real horror began. The holographic display shifted to show footage that made the previous wars look almost quaint by comparison. Dark figures moved through a city at night, their movements precise and coordinated, visible only through enhanced imaging technology that turned darkness into green-tinted clarity. "What are we watching now?" Blixara asked, though her crystalline voice had developed a tremor that made her segments rattle softly. "Modern human special operations," Vorgak replied, his tentacles moving frantically across his datapad. "These appear to be elite combat units conducting what they term surgical strikes in urban environments." The footage showed human soldiers moving through buildings with weapons that fired with barely audible whispers, eliminating targets with mechanical precision. They communicated through hand signals and electronic devices, coordinating attacks across multiple floors simultaneously. "They're fighting in complete darkness," Kelmax observed, his orange fur now permanently flattened against his skin. "How are they navigating? How are they identifying targets?" "Enhanced optical systems," Vorgak answered after consulting his readings. "They've developed technology that allows them to see in conditions that would blind most species. They've literally adapted their warfare to function in environments where normal combat is impossible." Commander Zeltron leaned forward, his three eyes tracking the movements of the human soldiers with professional interest that was rapidly being overtaken by professional concern. "Show me their environmental adaptations." The display obliged, shifting through footage of human combat operations in deserts where temperatures reached lethal extremes, Arctic conditions that would freeze most species solid, jungle environments so dense that visibility was measured in meters, and mountainous terrain at altitudes that would cause oxygen deprivation in most intelligent life forms. "They fight everywhere," Technician Moxar, a reptilian analyst who had been silent until now, spoke up with obvious disbelief. "Underwater, underground in atmospheric conditions that would kill them without protective equipment. There's no environment they consider unsuitable for warfare. The footage showed human frogmen conducting underwater demolitions, tunnel rats fighting in confined underground spaces, paratroopers jumping from aircraft into hostile territory, and mountain warfare specialists conducting operations at altitudes where the air was too thin to breathe normally. Pause the display, Vorgak requested, his tentacles now moving in agitated spirals. I need to run some calculations on their adaptation protocols. The room waited in tense silence while Vorgak worked. The only sounds were the clicking of his data entry and the increasingly labored breathing of several staff members who were having difficulty processing what they'd witnessed. The results are disturbing, Vorgak finally announced. Humans have developed specialized combat techniques for literally every environment on their planet and several off-planet conditions. Desert warfare, Arctic operations, jungle combat, urban fighting, mountain warfare, underwater operations, underground tunnel systems, and high-altitude combat. They've even developed tactics for fighting in zero gravity. Zero gravity? Blixara's segments clinked together nervously. They're preparing for space warfare? Apparently they consider it inevitable, Vorgax replied grimly. But that's not the worst part. I've been calculating their casualty-to-effectiveness ratios across all these environments. Commander Zeltron asked, though his tone suggested he didn't really want to know. In every single environment, no matter how hostile, no matter how unsuited to their biology, humans maintain operational effectiveness rates that exceed what we would consider possible. They don't just adapt to hostile conditions, they thrive in them. Analyst Krex, an insectoid specialist in xenobiology, suddenly stood up from his workstation. His compound eyes were reflecting the holographic light in a way that suggested extreme agitation. Commander, I formally request immediate transfer to the Department of Peaceful Botanical Studies. Denied, Zeltron snapped automatically. Sir, with respect, I've spent my career analyzing predator species across 17 different star systems. I've never encountered anything like this. These humans don't just fight in hostile environments. They seek them out. They train in them. They improve their combat effectiveness by deliberately placing themselves in conditions that should kill them. The footage resumed, showing human soldiers training in simulated combat scenarios that recreated every conceivable form of warfare. Underwater combat training, high-altitude warfare exercises, urban combat in mock cities designed to replicate enemy territory, survival training in environments that would challenge the hardiest species in the galaxy. They're not just adapting to fight in these conditions, Moxar observed with growing horror. They're specifically training to fight other humans who are equally adapted. They're preparing to fight themselves. Show me their current weapons technology, Commander Zeltron ordered, his voice now carrying the weight of someone who had moved far beyond simple concern. The display shifted to show human weapons that bore little resemblance to the primitive swords and muskets from earlier footage. Precision-guided munitions that could eliminate single targets from vast distances, electronic warfare systems that could disable entire enemy communications networks, and weapons that could level city blocks while leaving adjacent buildings untouched. The technological advancement curve is unprecedented, Vorgak reported, his tentacles now moving in patterns that indicated extreme stress. They've gone from throwing rocks to precision orbital bombardment in less than 10,000 years. Most species take 50,000 years to achieve similar technological integration. Analyst Yendrix, a peaceful herbivore species representative, slowly raised one of her 6 arms. Commander, I don't think I'm qualified for this type of analysis. Perhaps I should transfer to the Department of Agricultural Development. Permission granted, Zeltron replied immediately, apparently having given up on maintaining his staff. Sir. Blixara's crystalline voice was now producing harmonics that indicated severe stress. I've been reviewing their current global military expenditures. They're spending approximately 2 trillion of their monetary units annually on weapons development. That's more than most civilizations spend on their entire infrastructure. 2 trillion, Zeltron repeated slowly, on weapons, while they're supposedly at peace. That's the truly terrifying part, sir, Vorgak added quietly. According to their own records, they currently consider themselves to be in a relatively peaceful period. This is what human restraint looks like. The briefing chamber had grown noticeably emptier as more staff members found excuses to leave or submitted transfer requests. Those who remained sat in stunned silence, staring at the holographic display showing human military capabilities that defied every assumption they'd made about primitive species. Commander Zeltron looked around at his decimated staff and realized they hadn't even gotten to the really disturbing part yet. The final footage began innocuously enough. Human astronauts floating in what appeared to be a training facility, practicing movement in zero-gravity conditions. Commander Zeltron's remaining staff watched with the weary resignation of beings who had already seen too much. At least this looks peaceful, Kelmax muttered, though his orange fur remained stubbornly flat against his skin. Just some basic space exploration training. That optimism lasted exactly 47 seconds. The display showed the same astronauts still in zero gravity, now wielding weapons specifically designed for combat in vacuum conditions. They moved through mock spacecraft corridors, practicing room-to-room clearing techniques in an environment where a single puncture could kill everyone aboard. No, Blixara's crystalline segments began producing a high-pitched whine. No, they're not just exploring space. They're preparing to fight wars in space. The footage showed human astronauts training with weapons that fired projectiles designed to disable enemy spacecraft without breaching hulls, grappling techniques for hand-to-hand combat in zero gravity, and tactical maneuvers for boarding hostile vessels. Every movement was practiced, efficient, and utterly terrifying in its implications. They haven't even established permanent colonies beyond their home system, Vorgak observed with the tone of someone witnessing the impossible, and they're already developing combat doctrines for interplanetary warfare. Senior communications analyst Thrix, who had somehow survived the gradual exodus of staff members, suddenly stood up and began gathering his personal belongings. That's it. I'm done. I quit. I resign. I formally request immediate transfer to any department that doesn't involve studying species that weaponize vacuum. Thrix, sit down, Zeltron ordered, but his voice lacked any real conviction. Sir, they're training to fight in an environment that kills most life forms instantly. They're not just adapting to space, they're adapting to kill other beings in space. And the worst part? They're probably going to be really good at it. 4 more analysts stood up simultaneously, their resignation requests already prepared on their datapads. Sir, Junior Technician Plex spoke up from his workstation, his voice barely a whisper. I've been monitoring their global communications during this briefing. Would you like to know what humans are discussing while we watch their military capabilities? Do I have a choice? Zeltron replied grimly. They're debating whether they should send more relief supplies to disaster victims, arguing about environmental protection policies, and sharing pictures of small domestic animals on their communication networks. Sir, they genuinely believe they're a peaceful species. The briefing chamber fell into absolute silence. The remaining staff members stared at the holographic display showing human space combat training while processing the information that these same beings considered themselves peaceful. Peaceful, Vorgak repeated slowly. They consider themselves peaceful while maintaining enough weapons to sterilize their own planet 17 times over. And while training for wars that don't exist yet, Kelmax added, his voice hollow with disbelief. Commander Zeltron stood up slowly, his 3 eyes fixed on the display where human astronauts continued their zero-gravity combat exercises with casual proficiency. When he spoke, a cheery, his voice carried the weight of a career intelligence officer who had just discovered that everything he thought he knew about galactic threats was laughably inadequate. Effective immediately, Species File Human Terra Sol 3 is reclassified from primitive observation to extreme threat level alpha. He paused, looking around at his remaining staff. All personnel are hereby restricted to passive observation protocols only. No direct contact, no intervention, No communication attempts of any kind. Sir, Blixara asked quietly, what should we tell Command about our assessment? Zeltron considered this for a long moment, watching the humans on screen practice techniques for killing each other in the vacuum of space with the same casual efficiency they'd shown throughout their entire recorded history. Tell them we've encountered a species that considers global thermonuclear warfare an acceptable conflict resolution method. He has developed combat techniques for literally every environment in the known universe, including several that shouldn't be survivable, and genuinely believes they're peaceful. He turned away from the display. Then recommend that we establish a minimum safe observation distance of approximately 50 light-years. The holographic display finally shut down, leaving the briefing chamber in ordinary lighting that seemed almost anticlimactic after hours of witnessing humanity's approach to conflict resolution. As on the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star, 7 billion humans continued their daily lives, completely unaware that they had just terrified an advanced galactic intelligence agency into recommending they be avoided at all costs. Most of them were currently engaged in what they considered their favorite peaceful activities, arguing about sports, sharing videos of cats, and complaining about traffic. The galaxy's newest nightmare species was worried about whether they'd remembered to feed their pets.